Good afternoon to our viewers in the United States, and good evening to those following us today from Europe. Thank you for joining this discussion hosted by the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. My name is Jörn Fleck, and I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Council, and I'm very much looking forward to moderating today's public discussion on the 2025 Transatlantic Tech and Digital Agenda. In terms of our discussion today, I think the backdrop of the broader US-European or transatlantic partnership is key to the conversation. That backdrop has obviously been dominated by both foreign policy issues, especially the Trump administration's efforts to achieve a peace, a settlement of Russia's continued war in Ukraine, but also by the trade policy agenda, and especially President Trump's announcements of tariffs on a number of partners, and some across the board reciprocal tariffs to be coming in at the beginning of April. But digital issues in the transatlantic partnership have come up, with allegations from the new US administration of Europe extorting US tech firms, for example, or Europe not respecting free speech through its regulations, just to name two ways in which digital and tech issues have come up. At the same time, the tech and digital sector obviously remains a critical part of the $9 trillion economic relationship between the United States and Europe. So with that as the backdrop, and as part of our ongoing Transatlantic Digital Marketplace initiative at the Europe Center, we wanted to bring together two great experts to really have a look at how the broader transatlantic partnership and relationship is impacting the digital and tech agenda between the United States and Europe, what we can already tell in terms of trends, emerging issues, and new fault lines between the transatlantic partners when it comes to tech policy, and what we can tell about the general outlook, the agenda of transatlantic tech and digital policy. So we're delighted to have with us today for the discussion Dr. Frances Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center and the Managing Director at the Europe Practice of McLarty and Associates. Fran, great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
And we have with us Kenneth Propp, non-resident Senior Fellow, also at the Europe Center here at the Council, a former legal counsel at the U.S. Mission to the European Union, and Professor of European Union Law at Georgetown Law School. Ken, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jörn.
With that, I want to jump right into the conversation. Before we do that, a quick reminder that we would love to hear from our audience. You can submit your questions and comments at askac.org. That's askac.org. Send us your questions and comments, and we will try and bring them in as soon as we get into the conversation. With that, Fran, let's maybe kick off with you. You recently wrote a report for the Europe Center for the Atlantic Council, The Art of the Transatlantic Deal. I think everyone knows who and what you're referencing here. And you make the case for a perhaps less strategic but more transactional relationship between Washington and Brussels, between the United States and Europe, built around a series of deals. Against the backdrop of what we've seen, a fast evolving picture on the trade and economic policy front between the two partners, how do you see digital and tech policy issues fit into that art of a transatlantic deal, or the series of deals that you describe? What's even possible in terms of the big picture on the digital and tech policy front?
Well, thanks, Jörn. I think writing this paper and having it come out has been kind of a humbling experience, because I don't think I've had anything where it has been overtaken by events quite so quickly. But I think it's good first for everyone to remember how important the digital economy is in the transatlantic space. We hear a lot about the EU trade surplus in goods with the United States and the US deficit. But it's well worth remembering that the US has a surplus in the digital economy, in services, with the EU. And in fact, the US delivers about 320 billion digital services to Europe. That includes the UK. That was the number for 2023. And it's double those delivered to Asia or any other region. It's 49% of our exports of digitally enabled services go to Europe. And we have a surplus of about $105 billion, which is quite significant. Even more important than the services delivered across borders is the revenue earned by American companies whose subsidiaries are in Europe and providing information services. So 70% of all the information services provided by US companies around the world are provided in Europe. So the European market is a significant market for US tech. And I think that in this very transactional world that we're living in now, that's something to keep front and center in your mind. But the tech agenda is inevitably going to be affected very deeply by what is happening in terms of the tariffs, both proposed and those that have already gone into effect or are scheduled to go into effect. In fact, since the paper was published, we've had the reimposition and enhancement of steel and aluminum tariffs. And we just yesterday had the announcement of car tariffs, 25%, which will go into effect, I think, on April 3rd. But next week is the big week that we're really looking for. And there we could see so-called reciprocal tariffs. The rumors are 20 to 25% on the EU, a blanket tariff. But we don't really know. And we won't know, given the unpredictability of this administration, we won't know until it actually is announced. We may also see, and here is a direct impact on the digital economy, we may see the reimposition of retaliatory tariffs by the United States on those European countries that have digital services taxes. You may recall that during the first Trump administration, there was an investigation into DSTs, and those put forward by France, Italy, Spain, Austria, and the UK were found under Section 301 to be deserve retaliatory tariffs. Those tariffs did not actually go into effect because the Biden administration then went into the OECD tax rebalancing effort. But this administration has left that effort, an effort that had stumbled anyway. And so the president asked on, I think, the first day in office for USTR to look into what it would take to restart those tariffs. So we may see that next week. But I think that there also is another element of the tariffs that will directly impact the digital economy. And that is, as you gave reference to, the memo that the president put out that not only covered DSTs, but also covered regulations in other countries that imposed on US companies conditions that inhibit their growth or their global competitiveness, that jeopardize their intellectual property, or that cause them to limit freedom of speech online. And I think this is aimed squarely at the EU, although certainly it could be used with numerous countries, and maybe we will just have to see. But they use as examples rules that impact the free flow of data, and rules forcing US streaming services to produce local content. In the press availability surrounding this, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act were also cited. And I think, with the EU announcing earlier this week or late last week about Apple and Google being investigated under DMA, this is something that, this is an area where we can see a lot more conflict in the future than we have in the past. So I think that we have seen efforts by the EU to deal with this by having a deal. And that was the assumption that I had early on in my paper, which was that the tariffs were being used as leverage, and the idea was to bring people to the table. And in the days of earlier trade conflicts, that often worked. One put tariffs on, your partners raised the ante, and then everyone decided it was time to sit down and negotiate to get to much lower tariffs. And each would give something up to get that good, because lower tariffs were seen as a good. But if that's not the purpose of the tariffs, if the purpose of the tariffs is instead to restore US manufacturing and increase jobs, you're in a different environment. A deal would have to address the US deficit with Europe. And here I think, there have been numerous deals put forward in the press. I think all of them included LNG, some arrangement on cars until the president's announcement yesterday. The US tariff rate for passenger cars was 2.5%. And the EU rate was 10%. So there was room there for the EU to drop it a bit. And a pledge on defense equipment purchases by the Europeans, which they're going to have to do anyway. They will be buying lots of weapons from us for Ukraine for the next few years. So I think what we're seeing right now is a real change in the environment that the digital economy and that the digital policy world, transatlantic digital policy, is working on. It is an environment where I think the US government is going to challenge EU regulations, including regulations that are already in force and being worked on. It's also clear that US companies, at least certain ones, will have a much stronger backing from the US government. We are likely to see new issues emerge, such as the freedom of speech issue. But it's also going to be, I think, in an environment where everyone is thinking about what the next step is in the negotiation. So it seems like it's about tariffs and trade, but it has a big impact on the digital world as well.
Thank you, Fran, for giving us that broader context, but then also ending on how this may play out in different ways for the transatlantic tech and digital agenda. I do want to come back to those specific subsets of issues under that broad tech umbrella. But first, Ken, maybe I can ask you where you would agree most strongly, where you would disagree with Fran's assessment, what other implications and ways of this playing out on the tech and digital agenda between the United States and Europe would you highlight from your vantage point?
Thanks, Jorn. First, I would say that Fran's point about the intertwining, the interlinkage between trade and tech policy is really an essential change. And that means that tech policy coordination with Europe, to the extent that still is a prospect, can't be considered separately. It has to be considered together with the rather large overhang from the trade environment. I think another way of saying what Fran was saying about tariffs no longer necessarily being a way to get to a deal is that the Trump administration policy is essentially unilateralist. And it is very ambitious. We have seen in a number of technological areas, including AI policy already, that the US goal is unabashedly dominance.
Mhm.
Another point that I think is worth teasing out here a bit is that relates to Fran's comment about the possibility of retaliation if there's European regulatory actions against US tech giants. Remember that these are companies that do business in the European Union. And what we are talking about is the application of European Union law within European Union territory to US companies that are present there. And for the first time, we are seeing that linked to the possibility of retaliation by the United States through trade policy and other means. Fran mentioned the instruction that the president gave to USTR for its inquiries that will lead to results next week. There was also an interesting determination by the Secretary of State that came a couple of weeks ago, in which he determined that all US government efforts to control, among other things, the transfer of goods, services, data, and technology across the borders of the United States constitute a foreign affairs function. This is really novel. This is a way to coordinate within the US government through the State Department actions in this area. And it is also probably not incidentally an attempt to put measures that would ordinarily require slow, cumbersome proceedings for making rules under the Administrative Procedures Act, to put them under the foreign affairs exception to the APA, which allows much more rapid responses. So finally, and this is something I think we're going to get to later in the conversation, is as Fran alluded to, many major US technology companies will certainly welcome having the US government at their back in disputes over inquiries under the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, potentially the AI Act as well. That is a different dynamic from the Biden administration, which essentially agreed with the approach taken in those pieces of EU legislation. The consequence, however, is complicated for the companies in Europe because there's going to be a strong reaction under the rubric of digital sovereignty.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for highlighting those additional issues of the DPA, the implications on the digital sovereignty front. Well, I want to come back to that. But maybe, Fran, both of you highlighted how this is an entirely different approach by the new US administration in terms of its approach to Europe on anything digital regulation. On the US side, I think it was Vice President Vance recently, I think last week, spoke before a tech conference, essentially saying the Trump tech agenda is tax cuts, slashing regulation, making energy cheaper before the backdrop of AI development, and investing in US industry. And then you already mentioned that memo pushing back on so-called overseas extortion and excessive fines and penalties levied against US tech firms abroad. When you see that new approach, every action begets a reaction. You already saw when it comes to trade policy some rumors about the European Union using its new anti-coercion instrument against US big tech, so-called big tech. What is the most likely European reaction we're going to see, or reactions in plural, we're likely to see in response if this is the persistent policy we can likely expect for the foreseeable future from the US?
Well, I think the very first reaction has been one of disbelief, quite frankly, and also there has been a learning curve, which I think many Europeans have gone through, in terms of trying to understand the perspective of the administration. And I think that the language used about Europe in the recent Signal chat about the Houthis is one that probably removed some remaining illusions that some may have had about this administration still viewing Europe as a strategic partner, which it is clear they do not, at least among the individuals involved in the Signal chat. So I think there has been an attitude adjustment. The initial reaction beyond that has been retaliation. And I would not be surprised at all to see the retaliatory tariffs that the EU had on the steel and aluminum US tariffs fall into place mid-April, as the Commission has announced it is considering. And these will probably be expanded because the steel and aluminum tariffs have been altered as well. The administration moved the aluminum tariffs from 10% to 25% and also expanded to include derivative products. So the EU will up the ante as well. The car tariffs are another thing. In talking about reciprocal tariffs, I mentioned the difference before. If it had gone up to 10%, I think the EU would just have said, well, that's okay. But 25%, I think that there will be a lot of pressure for retaliation. You are also right that particularly on areas that are not, let's call them traditional trade disputes, border tariffs, etc. The Anti-Coercion Act is intended for the EU to defend itself through the use of tariffs and other measures, which can include limits on digital services, to defend itself against those who would try to change EU policy. The listeners may recall that one of the Baltic states allowed the Taiwanese government, the Taiwan government, to set up an office, and China then took umbrage at this and put sanctions and other restrictions on its on some of its trade. And the Union tried to respond jointly, but didn't really have a lot of mechanisms. And the anti-coercion instrument comes out of that experience. So that's another possibility. However, I think there are some things that should be considered before the tariffs are put in place. First off, we've already seen that it's the more you put tariffs in place, you also bring about even more retaliation or threats of retaliation from the United States. So we saw the president threaten 200% tariffs on European alcoholic drinks. And you also put, the more tariffs you put on, the more you see damage to the European economy itself. Tariffs are a self-inflicted wound in many regards. The theory is that it will hit certain US products, and the makers of those products will go to the White House and say, please help us get rid of this. We need a deal. This is too painful for us. We have not seen in this administration yet much tendency of the administration to listen to those kinds of entreaties. I think it's possible that one could do a test case with either coal and steel or autos and see if it does actually bring the United States to the bargaining table. But I think that the European reaction to efforts to change digital regulation, aside from the tariff question, those efforts to change digital regulation, I think, for the most part, are going to fall on deaf ears. I think that the DSA and the DMA are regarded in Europe as legitimate regulation, and Ken is right about, you can disagree with Europe about the content of their regulation and whether it's good for the European economy or not. But it is within Europe's right and the right of Europe's governments and legislators to make those regulations. And those who participate in the European market are expected to adhere to them, just as we would expect the same of anyone in the US, a foreign company participating in the US market. So I think, we have seen some retrenchment of European regulation in recent months through the omnibus proposal, which is not passed yet. We've seen some potential delay to some European regulations, but those are largely regulations that are not yet in force. They have been passed, but not implemented, at least not beyond the reporting stage. So I think we're heading into some difficult times where neither party is going to want to back down.
Thank you, Fran. Ken, let me ask you similar follow-up to what Fran just said. We have also seen the last European transition, European Parliament elections, a new commission coming in the end of last year, a real focus on the long-term competitiveness of the European Union. And clearly, tech and digital policy have been a key aspect of the discussion of that. Fran mentioned already the omnibus and some other regulatory areas like ESG or climate and other issues. But when it comes to tech policy, do you see this European competitiveness debate and supposed push from the EU institutions and member states on that front maybe play out to diffuse some of the concerns on the US side? Or is that divide and the push from the Trump administration when it comes to maybe rolling back aspects of the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, as really, is there any potential for that, or how are you seeing that?
Well, the easing of regulatory requirements in the service of greater European competitiveness is a real thing. The Commission is pursuing this. Now, what it seems to amount to so far is reduction in reporting requirements, for example, other sorts of requirements on small and medium-sized business. Coupled with an insistence that the underlying laws themselves are going to be maintained and continue to be enforced. So I don't regard that as something that will have a really large impact in the transatlantic area. It is significant within Europe. I mean, there are talks of even rolling back requirements under the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been enforced for years now. Indeed, the German coalition discussions over the last weeks have featured this topic. They're talking about creating a digital ministry. They're talking about retitling the Federal Data Protection Agency into a data usage agency. These are not insignificant changes, and coming from a country like Germany, which is kind of the spiritual father of data protection law, they are significant. Let me just also mention, not in relation to existing laws, but things that may be coming. There has been a debate for 2 years now in Europe on something called the EU Cyber Security Certification Scheme, and this is an attempt to harmonize cybersecurity requirements within Europe, in itself a sensible thing. But it has turned into a debate about whether foreign and particularly US providers should be able to obtain the highest level certification, and questions raised, particularly coming from France, that because these companies are subject to foreign law and potentially foreign government surveillance activities, they should not be granted that privilege. I think we are going to see a renewed debate about EUCS, which has basically been fought to a standstill in recent years with a number of member states, including Nordic states, not endorsing the French approach. Germany has been on the fence. Germany may no longer be on the fence about that. Also interesting is that even the far right MEPs from France have begun to speak out regarding digital sovereignty in the European Parliament, showing that they are very much in line with the French mainstream parties. So in sum, the forces for digital sovereignty are gaining ground in the EU in both legislative and regulatory initiatives. And this in itself may lead to a confrontation with the Trump administration, as Fran had suggested, and it may well be a confrontation that the US administration would even welcome.
Thank you, Fran. That gives me a good segue to the digital sovereignty issues. You have both written 2 reports on that concept of European tech or digital sovereignty. Fran, you mentioned that as part of your potential, how you see potential European reactions. Ken gave us some specific examples through EUCS, but also the current government formation or negotiations for that in Germany, and how things may shift there. How do you see that issue of tech sovereignty playing out, and what role do you see that playing? A, what form do you see that taking? And then B, what role do you see that playing in the transatlantic digital discussions?
So one thing I think that we've seen even before the Trump administration came into office, really going back to the Letta and the Draghi reports, is we've seen an evolution from digital sovereignty to tech sovereignty, is the way that I would put it. Whereas you're talking less about cloud services and platforms, things of that sort, online, and also talking about the technologies, the other technologies that are essential to the growth of the European economy or the future of the European economy. So this could be batteries, it could be electrolyzers, a whole raft, chips, a raft of things that are about the next phase of the economy, whether that is powering data centers and doing so in a green way, or whether it is having the computational power to deal with AI. And I think you see this still very much in the work program of the second von der Leyen Commission. And one of the things we expect to see later this year is another version of the Data Act, which will be more about supporting the use of data and making it more commercial within the EU, making it more commercially available. But we don't really know yet what it is because we haven't seen the proposal. But I think that in general, what you're seeing is in Europe is how to boost the capacity that they have. For example, making some of the supercomputers that exist in Europe available to NGOs and small businesses for very modest rates, if not on a free basis. So things that can you use state resources to help companies get going? And we just had the release of a strategy for a savings and investment union, which addresses capital markets union, the need for more capital for investment in these areas in Europe. And this harks back to the original foundation, if you will, of digital sovereignty, of the urge to have digital sovereignty in Europe, which is that Europe has not succeeded in scaling up digital companies for the most part. Those companies, for a variety of reasons, end up being overshadowed by US companies or purchased by US companies. And many European startups migrate to the United States in terms of finance, in search of financing. What I think we're seeing now, though, is I think we started this commission with an effort to say there are key areas where we need to put in resources so that we can build our digital economy. And that's the way we're going to go. It's going to be less regulation, less about stopping things and more about supporting things. But what's happened over the last couple of months is that I think we are seeing, exactly as Ken described, a rebirth of the old digital sovereignty debate, which is about excluding, not so excluding US, but also excluding others who don't have particular bounds, particular ties with Europe. And it's not just in the digital area. We've seen it with the new plan for how to spend defense funds and who can be eligible for procurement. And that includes member states. It includes others with whom the EU has a defense partnership. And it includes some accession states. It doesn't include the United States. It also does not include the UK right now. But I think you can't isolate the digital sovereignty debate and what's happening in Europe there. And I agree with Ken that EUCS, we're going to see a rebirth of what we saw before. You can't isolate it from these other instances where the Trump administration threatened to cut off military supplies to Ukraine. And for many Europeans, that made the US look like an unreliable partner. And so the natural proclivity then is to look to your own resources. So I think we will see a digital sovereignty debate that is louder and noisier and perhaps more extensive. But I think we have to also figure out, I think some of this is inspired, unfortunately, by Trump administration actions and language.
Fran, let me follow up with a question. You already mentioned emerging technologies in a number of ways. When it comes to artificial intelligence, which is such a big part of that transatlantic, or was under the previous administration and previous commission, I should maybe say, was such a big part of that transatlantic digital conversation, the Trade and Technology Council as a cooperation forum or consultation forum that we had. We had the European Union also very proudly roll out and pass its comprehensive AI Act regulation, the first ever, if you follow the Commission talking points. But we've seen a drastic shift since then, both in the United States, where President Trump came in and dropped the Biden administration's executive order on AI, mainly when it comes to U.S. government use and development of AI. We had the AI Safety Institute's cooperation basically dropped. But even in the European conversation, there's been a shift from maybe a safety focus to a competitiveness and competition innovation focus, I guess I would say. We saw the most recent AI summit not be the AI safety, but AI action summit, right? And just small things giving you a sense of that shift. Do you see with those shifts, even though they're different in substance and tone on both sides of the Atlantic, do you see any potential for the United States and the European Union coming back together to some form of cooperation on the AI front? Or are we just simply seeing what I think Ken called a US AI dominance approach and an EU approach that's maybe a lot more nuanced or fragmented in many ways?
I think there are a lot of unknowns about this. And given the unpredictability of this administration, but just also generally, it may be that in another year, or maybe even 6 months, that the administration may be forced to rethink some of its views on unfettered AI development policy. So you never know what's going to happen in terms of things that affect an administration. There was a British statesman who used to say, events, dear boy, events is what really drives government, rather than what you think and what your ambition, your objectives are when you come in. So I think that we have seen movement in both areas towards innovation. How does AI intersect with the economy, et cetera? One of the things that the Biden administration and the European Union worked on a lot was trying to figure out AI standards and how to implement those internationally and multilaterally. I don't foresee at the current moment much focus or support for the Hiroshima process, for example, which puts more limits on AI. But I suspect that within the international standard bodies, there may be room for US-EU collaboration on a technical level for AI standards, because if we don't collaborate, it will be the Chinese who run those standards. So, and I don't think that the Trump administration would like that to be the outcome. But I think right now we need for the rhetoric to cool off. And I think Ken is right about seeing some retrenchment. And I think one thing that might be up for that is in the AI Act, removing some of the requirements for SMEs. So there might be some moderation of the AI Act before it goes fully into force. I don't see a whole lot that's going to be that will relieve the regulatory burden on major US AI developers, just small developers, which will almost always, if they're in the European market, be European. So we have to lower the rhetoric, not worry so much about the AI Act, and think about the global situation and whether we want to have US and European standards. And I don't think the US can get its own standards by itself through these bodies. Can we get those done rather than having the Chinese reassert the earlier dominance they had in some of these standard setting bodies?
Thank you, Fran. I want to encourage, I know we have already a number of questions coming in from our viewers on askac.org, but please submit more and I will get to these after the next question to Ken. Shifting slightly to a different field, you already mentioned the US-EU data privacy framework, some developments there with the Trump administration pushing an order for members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to resign, and that's the board that would allow for oversight of, on the US side, of the DPF, the Data Privacy Framework, the successor to Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor, or expansion or upgrade, however you want to view that. We also have a decision by the European Court of Justice on a judicial challenge to the DPF outstanding and probably coming up fast. This is a field, transatlantic and international data transfers is an issue, Ken, that you're a leading expert in. If you watch closely, have written about extensively on that front. What do you think we can expect with a very transformed political backdrop, especially in the United States, but also in terms of the reaction to US engagement or Trump administration engagement on the European front?
Well, this has been a decade-long saga of fragile data transfer agreements, periodically struck down by the EU courts. As you mentioned, there is another challenge about to come before the General Court, which is the lower instance of the ECJ. Next week, the hearing will be on April Fool's Day. And this is a case that's been brought by a French parliamentarian, essentially making the same arguments that have been made over the years, that the US commitments to protect Europeans' data do not measure up to the fundamental rights standards in the EU Charter, despite the many commitments that the US has made. Already there has been some weakening in the US position as a result of the dismissal of the Democratic members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the dismissal of the Democratic commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission. Those are two oversight bodies that are very much part of the data protection framework. We have also seen a lot of press reports about alleged access by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency to the personal data of US federal employees and indeed Americans generally. Those get attention in Europe. European judges read the newspapers. So I think there is a real prospect that this case that is about to be heard, which frankly many observers had discounted for a long time, feeling that it had procedural weaknesses, that the court may be eager to get to the merits in this case. Now, what has not changed, at least so far, is that the executive order that puts a data privacy review court into place for the United States within the Justice Department, that EO stands. And that is really the crucial component of the oversight and judicial review mechanism. So it's by no means a sure thing that the latest framework is going down, but I think the prospects that it may have unfortunately increased. You know, the European Commission for the moment is remaining very studiously neutral about this. They have said only that they are watching these developments in relation to the FTC and the PCLOB and the other steps in the United States, but there has been no suggestion on the part of the Commission to remove the adequacy finding that allows data to flow across the ocean. I think the Commission is not eager to revisit this issue again with the United States. It's been an enormously burdensome and repetitive process over the past several years. One other important development in this area, outside of the case that is challenging the data protection framework, is that there is litigation moving through the ECJ on the question of whether individuals can get damages, pecuniary damages for privacy injuries. And for the very first time, the EU courts have put a dollar figure, a euro figure on damages. And when you multiply that by the new possibility of class action in the consumer area in Europe, what they call representative actions, This creates potentially enormous liability for U.S. cloud providers. So that is another important shift in the environment that we're going to be seeing play itself out over the next few years.
Thank you, Ken, for also putting some of these issues, bring those into our conversation. I want to go to questions from our audience and maybe get some quick replies. A number of these we've sort of touched on indirectly, but let's bring them in nevertheless and highlight some different angles. And if I can get quick answers, and you guys let me know who wants to jump in from you, Fran and Ken. First one, the Commission decided to remove the AI liability directive from the Commission's 2025 work program. Are we already witnessing sort of the beginnings of the Commission's deregulation agenda take shape that could appease Washington's stance? I think we touched on that, but this is a very specific and good specific example here, Fran.
So I think the removal of the AI product liability, I forget if it was a directive or regulation, but the removal of that from the work program, I think is an indication more of the EU's competitiveness debate itself. There are liabilities rules in the EU, so there was already an argument that this was a duplicative effort, but rather than seeing it as a response to the US, I would see it as a response to Mario Draghi. So
a response to Mario, not Donald. Okay.
right.
Next question. Do you foresee the Trump administration sinking negotiations at the OECD level on digital services taxes and go full force with USTR and the Department of Commerce and impose retaliatory tariffs, prioritizing economic sovereignty over diplomacy? I mean, the first step in that has already been made, right?
Yes,
The
yes.
withdrawal of the United States from that deal at the OECD level. But I don't know, Ken, whether you have any thoughts on sort of this set of issues and how that might play out transatlantically.
Well,
DSTs, I mean by that, and retaliation of the United States.
Yeah, it is difficult to separate out the question of retaliation here. I think EU member state governments and the EU itself are going to have to think very carefully about imposing digital services tax because of the very strong likelihood of US retaliation. That has already been signaled that taxes on conduct within the EU may well lead to retaliation. And indeed, I mean, that logic potentially extends beyond digital services taxes to other sorts of taxes as well. So this is an area in which real escalation is a possibility.
Let me just say that I think we'll all be watching the UK and India in particular closely, because both have indicated that they might adjust their DST to take into account US concerns, but I haven't seen yet how they plan to adjust. There are different types of digital service taxes. Some, like the French one, are based on revenues, and others are more like a tax every time you download something. So they do vary.
Thank you both. Last question from our viewers, and I think it's a good one to end on. I'll pose it to both of you. Hopefully, with both of you finding some grounds for optimism here. As we look ahead, what is left for the potential future of transatlantic cooperation? You can combine, that is really with another question. Is the Trade and Technology Council that I mentioned earlier, is it simply dead? And are the United States and the EU bound to diverge under the current administrations on both sides on tech policy, as I said, at least under the current administrations in DC and Brussels? At the Europe Center and through our Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative, we always try and forge cooperation, dialogue, and understanding. That may be in the short term, at least, a difficult question. But Fran, Ken, please give us your quick take on what is the potential or for cooperation between the United States and Europe, or are we simply bound to see a divergence in tech and digital policies for the time being?
Well, let me go first and leave the last word to Fran here. But I think there will continue to be pockets where cooperation is possible. And I'll point to just one somewhat surprising that exists in the data transfer areas. The U.S. made a rather striking reversal in its open data flows policy about a year and a half ago, imposing first regulatory and then legislative restrictions on certain data transfers to China, Russia, and several other countries that are deemed to be foreign adversaries. So that's the outbound flow of data. The EU, which has long worried about data transfers to the United States, has allowed data transfers to China and to Russia to continue unrestricted, including through this period of great geopolitical conflict. But that now is starting to change in Europe. Individual data protection authorities have started investigations first into data transfers to Russia. And now we are at the brink of a decision by the Irish Data Protection Authority on data transfers to TikTok in China. And so I think in this area, attitudes are starting to align. And there may be the possibility for frank conversation on further alignment.
So I think, well, unfortunately, I have to say that the TTC is at least in the deep freeze, possibly to reawaken, we can hope, at a later time. I like Ken's word of pockets of things that can be addressed. I think, as I pointed out at the very beginning, this relationship, the digital economy relationship, is very valuable for many US companies. And so I think that is going to be something that continues to drive the US and the EU and other Europeans, such as the UK, together, rather than seeing a total split. I think cybersecurity is an area of possible conversations and cooperation. The cybersecurity dialogue, I think, was, if not launched, then certainly continued throughout the first Trump administration. And I think that would be well worth looking at. I think also more work on standards in emerging technologies and in the digital field is something that both will want to pursue and want to pursue more together, or at least in alignment, rather than letting the Chinese and others just dominate the field. So there are areas it's going to be tough. I think it would be helpful if both sides dial back some of the rhetoric that we've seen. On the US side, a more dominance rhetoric is not helpful. On the European side, a sovereigntist rhetoric is not helpful. But again, coming back to the fact that this is a market that is only going to grow. And Europe is a major part of the US market in digital services and technologies. And I think that's going to push the two to find areas where they can cooperate.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Fran and Ken, for joining us to discuss the outlook for the transatlantic tech and digital agenda under a new US administration, a relatively new European Commission, and a very challenging geopolitical backdrop to that agenda. I think less talk of US dominance or tech dominance, let's say, less talk about European tech sovereignty and building out those pockets of cooperation that you both mentioned as potential for a cooperative agenda is the key takeaway here at the end. Thank you to our viewers for the great questions. Thank you for following us, and continue to follow our work at the Europe Center's Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative and our work on the US-EU Tech and Digital Agenda. With that, thank you for now. See you very soon. Thanks, Fran and Ken.
Thanks.
Bye.